After a soccer match earlier this weekend in Turkey, a twin suicide bombing took the lives of 38 people and injured more than 160 others. Officials believe the bombing was the work of the Kurdish terrorist group TAK, an offshoot of the PKK. This is the 19th terrorist incident in Turkey in 2016. In 2015 alone, suicide attacks around the world reportedly killed or injured more than 9,000 civilians. Most suicide bombings target Muslims rather than non-Muslims. Yet, there's this widespread perception in the West that suicide bombings tend to be carried out by Muslims against non-Muslim targets and serve this religious purpose rooted deep within Islamic doctrine. Suicide bombings have been around since the 18th century. But I want to talk about suicide bombings as a tool of modern terrorist warfare and how it became the archetype of Muslim violence. Because while popular culture depicts Muslims as trigger-happy suicide bombers, suicide has always been a cardinal sin in Islam. By contrast, martyrdom, or when Allah decides when you die in battle while protecting your country, is sanctioned in certain verses throughout the Quran. This is where the misinformation comes from, because a frequently cited verse is the Al-Baqara verse. And say not of those who are killed in the way of Allah, they are dead, nay, they are living, but you perceive it not.
One should defend the realm of Islam and Muslims against heretics and invaders. And to fulfill this duty, one should even sacrifice one's life.
I mentioned this distinction because despite what both Islam's fiercest critics and also the most fervent adherents say, there are no verses in the Quran that explicitly urge Muslims to take their own lives, and many verses that describe suicide as a sin. And the connection between suicide bombings and militant Islamic ideology can be traced back to Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iran-Iraq war that raged during the 1980s. For the first time ever, Khomeini took this concept of self-sacrifice that was already prominent within Iranians' Shia interpretation of the Quran and extended it to taking one's life for the greater cause of promoting the Iranian Revolution. For Khomeini specifically, that also included expanding Islam's role in the war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Khomeini picked young boys who were susceptible to indoctrination and marched them through minefields, using their bodies to clear paths for Iranian forces to walk through. He would give these children keys to symbolically represent that they would be unlocking the gates of heaven. This tactic shocked the world. And while many within the Islamic world were horrified, Syrian president at the time, Hafez al-Assad, who's actually the father of the current Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, saw an opportunity. He then expanded on the idea of using self-sacrifice not only as a means of defense, but also as an offensive weapon when he sent in Shiite suicide bombers behind the wheel of a bus packed with 2,000 pounds of explosives into a US Marine base in Lebanon. The Shiite militants Assad helped assemble eventually became what we know as the Hezbollah. Now, suicide is a sin in Islam. I've mentioned this before. It's a sin in both of the other Abrahamic religions as well, Christianity and Judaism. But these new interpretations, combined with the near constant struggle against what was perceived as occupying forces, created this new reality within the fringes of the Islamic community that glorified suicide. And after Hamas's adoption of this radical interpretation, suicide bombing actually became a tactic employed by the Sunni as well as Shiite militants. And that's when we truly saw the devastating power of suicidal attacks. In the 90s, Hamas started targeting Israeli citizens by strapping explosives made from household items onto women and children and detonating them in public places. Now, this was out of the norm for two reasons. Because the Shia interpretation of the Quran offers some leeway around self-harm to allow for self-sacrifice, but the Sunni interpretation strictly prohibits it. Also, until this point, only occupying combatants were targeted, whereas now civilians were being victimized. Now, Egyptian Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi offers a very unique justification for this.
It's not suicide. It is martyrdom in the name of God. Islamic theologians and jurisprudents have debated this issue. Israeli women are not like women in our society because Israeli women are militarized.
Sunni extremist adoption of suicide bombing that targeted civilians proved critical. Once attacks against civilians could be justified, the words in the Quran no longer meant anything. I don't even know if they meant anything to begin with. But according to a 2012 study published in the National Counter-Terrorism Center, Sunni extremists account for the greatest number of terrorist attacks and fatalities for the third consecutive year, where more than 5,700 incidents were attributed to Sunni extremists, accounting for nearly 56% of attacks, but most importantly, 70% of all fatalities. Now, this perverted version of Islam appends more than thousands of years of consensus interpretation of the Quran and is now being used to indoctrinate youths in countries crippled by war, in states where citizens have very little access to the basic amenities that many other governments provide. Young people with nowhere else to turn seek answers from these religious leaders, and those religious leaders are not shy about pointing the finger of blame at the Western occupying forces and justifying attacks against fellow Muslims as a means of advancing their own agendas. While power-hungry religious clerics and other Islamic leaders have promoted suicide bombings as a justifiable tool of war, the majority of Muslims condemn it, just like the Quran does. And suicide bombings have always been used to achieve political ends and have nothing to do with waging holy war, no matter what the Western media, Islam's critics, or religious clerics will have you believe. The attack committed by the PKK on Turkish soil is merely the latest example. Religion is simply a recruitment tool targeting the undereducated, the vulnerable, and the disaffected. A violent means for a violent end. I'm Hassan Piker, and this is The Breakdown.